Hello and welcome back. So today we're talking about virtue ethics. So if you recall, utilitarians and deontologists disagreed on a lot of things, but one of the most basic things they disagreed on are what kinds of things are good and bad. So you recall utilitarians, or at least act utilitarians, say um, moral goodness and badness are properties of actions, right? Actions are the things you judge and say that was Kant said the only thing that is good in itself is the will, if you recall, right? So for Kant, the only things that are good or bad are the will, or intention. Virtue ethics, um, this goes back to Aristotle, right? So we talked about, we read one of the dialogues of Socrates, right? Where he introduced the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Socrates was the teacher of Plato. Plato was the one that wrote the dialogue about Socrates, and Aristotle was a student of Plato. So here we have our third generation of Greeks, and each one has a very different approach to ethics. We didn't, apart from uh, Plato's take on divine command theory, we didn't get too much into the Socrates and Plato, but Aristotle is sort of the inventor of virtue ethics. Uh, how virtue ethics differs from utilitarians and deontologists at the most basic level is the sorts of things that they think are good and bad. It's not actions per se, it's not intentions per se, but you might say that it's people, right? So, what sort of things are good and bad? Well, people. There's good people and bad people. And then want to do good things, right? So there is a sense in which they can also call action good. But if you want to know, what's a good thing to do, you ask yourself, what would a good person do? So it kind of the locus of morality is in human beings, right? Of course, you need to further ask, okay, so good people, what makes a good person good and a bad person bad? So for Aristotle, what makes you a good person is that you have certain. So obviously, virtue ethics is very old, right? It goes all the way back to Aristotle. It sort of got revived by Elizabeth Anscombe. And you may recall Elizabeth Anscombe, right? She was uh, critical of Harry Truman getting the honorary degree at Oxford because of the way he ended World War II using the atomic bomb, right? So that was Anscombe, and we use her as an example of a deontologist. But later in her career, she sort of got disillusioned with deontology and utilitarianism for all the reasons that we've seen, right? There are sort of some deep problems with each. Uh, and so she sort of led the revival of turning to virtue ethics, maybe the better approach, right? That avoids the problems that ontology have. So what makes a good person good is that they have virtue. So what is a virtue? Um, Aristotle has a lot of things to say about what a virtue is. One thing is that it's a trait of character manifested in habitual action, right? So it's a character trait. It's something that a human possesses, right? That would a characteristic of a human's personality. Now, it's important that it's habitual action, right? So, one example of a virtue would be honesty, right? Um, you're not an honest person if you only tell the truth once in a while, right? Or if you only do it when it's convenient. In order to have the virtue of honesty, you have to tell the truth habitually, right? It kind of needs to be your go-to. And also, not just any habit is a virtue. There are good and bad habits, right? So the bad version of a virtue, so the opposite of virtues, are vices. So you can have all sorts of character traits, right, that are manifested in your habitual actions. They may be good, in which case they're virtues. They may be bad, in which case they're vices, right? So how do we know the difference, right? Which character traits, right, that are habitual are the good ones and which are the bad ones? Aristotle offers a few ways to distinguish them. So one way he makes the distinction between virtues and vices is in how they affect other people. So some character traits will attract people, right? People want to be around them, people want to interact with people when they have certain character traits and certain habits. Other types of character repel people, right? And they make people not want to hang out with you. So in general, the attractive ones are vices, and right, the repellent ones, sorry, the attractive ones are virtues, and the repellent ones are vices. Now, all of this is very context sensitive. So, for example, it might, if I'm looking for an auto mechanic, right, and I want to know, what would be a virtuous auto mechanic, what would attract me to, patronizing a certain mechanic over another one, in that very specific case, it would be something like, skilled, right, talented and knowledgeable about cars, also, charges fair prices, is honest and doesn't try to, rip you off or say that you need to want to fix, prompt, right, things like that, right? So everything in virtue ethics is very context sensitive, right? So if I'm looking for a teacher, right, well, what sort of virtues would attract me to a certain teacher that I want to take classes from them? Again, you want them to be knowledgeable and articulate, but also hopefully patient. Again, fair, right? And you could. Uh, so there are specific virtues to specific occupations or specific roles in life you might have as a parent or as a as a child or as a uh, son or as a daughter and so on. And there are more general virtues that, by and large, anyone should want to have. So, I mean, here's sort of a partial list of the sorts of things that we consider virtues. Should feel intuitive. Benevolence, ability, compassion, conscientiousness, cooperativeness, courage, fairness. I won't just read the whole list here, but honesty. These are all, yeah, good character traits in general. Another important way of distinguishing virtues that they lie on what has come to be called the golden mean. The mean is the average, the mathematical average. According to Aristotle, virtues exist on a continuum between two extremes. So, one of the virtues is courage, right? So courage actually is in the middle of two vices. So on one end is cowardice, right? So if you are, right, so imagine one of the virtues you might want in a military person, a soldier, would be courage, right? So what would cowardice look like? Well, it would mean being afraid to go into battle or running the other way, or well, that's a vice. That's not a virtue. You can also there's another extreme, which you might call foolhardiness, right? Not even thinking about tactics or strategy or waiting for your opportunity, right? When you can pop out and get a shot off, and instead just running battle, right? Well, without weapons, without armor, like that's just foolishness. You'll get yourself shot immediately, and you'll put uh, your compatriots in danger, right? So Aristotle says a virtuous person is the one that rides the line between the two extremes, right? The golden mean, right? Now, here's a possible objection, right, or an interesting thing to consider, maybe for a paper. Um, and by the way, if you've already sort of given an essay proposal, um, feel free to change your mind at any point between now and when the draft is due, or between when the draft is due and the final version is due. Um, Sometimes that's how it goes, right? You come up with your idea a little bit later. So this could be a paper topic. Um, so courage is in the middle, right? The golden mean between the two extremes of cowardice and foolhardiness. Um, but does it also need to be in the service of a good cause to count as courage? So, for example, right, they were probably Nazi soldiers that were right in the middle of that golden mean, right? They were very good soldiers and they weren't cowardly, but they weren't foolish. Um, would we call them courageous, right? Or are you resistant to calling them courageous because, what they were doing was ultimately evil, I would think. So, it's not something Aristotle addresses directly. It's an interesting question, right? Intuitions could go either way. You could say, yeah, they were courageous people, but they just were in the service of an evil cause. Or some people might want to say, no, if you're doing something wrong, then you can't be counted as courageous. So, more examples. generosity, right? So generosity is a virtue, but again, it lies in the middle of two extremes. So on one extreme is stinginess, right? Who's someone who won't give anything to anybody ever. But on the other extreme is extravagance, where you just give away everything, right? So like, you know, I'd like to be a generous person, but that doesn't mean I should, I also have a wife and a child. It doesn't mean I should give away everything I have and leave myself and my family homeless, right? Some generous is somewhere in the middle, right? When you have enough, right, then you're willing or something like that. Now, remember, Aristotle's an ancient Greek, right, living before Christianity, um, and he's really got a pretty different take than, the Jesus of the New Testament, right? So Jesus seemed to advocate for a much more extreme version of generosity, right, where he would really extreme poverty, right, gave away everything. Um, didn't think that you should really have any possessions or amass any wealth. In that way, Jesus kind of looks more like a utilitarian, right? That the too demanding aspect of utilitarianism, where it seems like you can even ever buy a cup of coffee for yourself because you generate more happiness by giving to someone who's starving, right? That kind of seems like the Jesus is advocating that extreme utilitarianism. So virtue ethics, one of the good things, one of the things in favor of virtue ethics for many people is like it lines up a bit more with how we actually live our lives, and it seems a little less demanding, right? Um, yeah, be generous, of course, but that doesn't mean give away everything, right? It means it gives you a little room to, spend some money on college and pursue a career, right? That's important to you, develop your talents, right? So, um, and importantly, for Aristotle, he used the term happiness just like utilitarians do, but he meant something very different by it. So, again, for the utilitarians, happiness is just pleasure, the absence of pain. The Greek word for happiness that Aristotle uses, eudaimonia, translates roughly as thriving, right? Which means just, you know, exercising your particular abilities, um, developing them, and being sort of the best you can be. So virtue ethics leaves room for that, right? Like utilitarianism might not. Another example of a virtue that lies on the golden mean between two extremes, honesty, right? So recall, one of the problems for Kant and deontology was that, Kant says, well, you can never lie, right? Because you can't universalize it, right? You can't universalize that maxim. Uh, so you just can't lie, even to save a life, right? But Aristotle's take on honesty is very different. He says, look, honesty is in the mean between two extremes, right? One extreme, yeah, is being a liar or being too deceptive, right? Um, but the other extreme is being sort of honest to a fault, right? So, suppose this your good friend here comes in with her green prickly outfit and says, "Hey, I just bought this dress. I want to go out tonight. What do you think? Doesn't it look great?" Um, you know, depends on the circumstances, but sometimes you might want to say, "Wow, that's really interesting and cool," and I think it's really striking. You say something like that, right? You don't have to hurt people's feelings, right? If you're a little kid, you and says, "Look at what I painted, Daddy." Are you really going to tell them what you think, as an art critic, or are you just going to say, "Wow, that's great," right? And similarly, in a more extreme circumstance, I'm hiding a Jewish person in my house. The Nazis come knocking on my door. Should I tell them where my Jewish friend is, or should I lie? According to Aristotle, yeah, maybe you can still be an honest person, but lie to save a life, right? Honesty is in the middle between the two extremes. Such a thing as being too honest, right? Another thing that in favor of virtue ethics is that it makes sense of why we feel more duty to our friends and our family than to strangers on the other side of the world. Remember, this was a problem with utilitarianism. Everyone's happiness counts equally, so I can't buy my partner, right, or my mother a nice gift if that money could be spent again to save a starving person's life. But for Aristotle, you have different roles, right, in your life, and each role has its own specific set of virtues. So Yeah, general beneficence to humanity is a virtue, right? And you do have certain obligations in that virtue, but also being a good friend, right? And being a good husband or wife, right? Or partner. Um, this devotion to your friends and family, that's also a virtue, and it demands different things, right? And in fact, being a good friend and good family member demands more of you than being generally beneficent to your fellow humans, right? Um, that's okay, right? You can do both. You can have both those virtues and different things. So, as I said, well, I think I already discussed this, right? So, yeah, Aristotle, right? Happiness is flourishing, right? Exercising your capacities, and so having the virtues will help you do that, right? So being virtuous does lead to happiness, right? Um, not You'll see when we read Aristotle a bit later, because the next reading is Aristotle's actual writing, translated into English from the ancient Greek. Um, but at certain points, he does say the ultimate goal of human life is happiness, right? Um, but that's for him is deeply tied up with that's kind of the only way to be happy. And you have to remember that for him, happiness means something slightly different than the utilitarian. I mean, very different, actually. Aristotle actually believed um, you could be made unhappy after you're dead if things don't work out well for your children, right? So obviously it means something very different than pain. You can't feel pain when you're dead, right? Somehow the whole trajectory of your life can be affected, sort of retroactively if your offspring don't do well. So, different picture, right? But still aimed at happiness in a sense. So are the virtues the same for everyone? Yes and no, right? Uh, you compare this to Nietzsche. So we don't talk about Nietzsche too much in this class. We don't really have time. He's an interesting philosopher. He has a very different, very antagonistic towards Christianity, right? Christianity, what he called slave morality, right? And all this, all the humility of Christianity, and turn the other cheek and inherit the earth. He found that sort of disgusting, right? And he thought it was a religion, um, right? People on the lower rungs of society just trying to make themselves feel better about the fact that they were sort of like you know, just lost, the game of life, right? So interesting guy, very different sort of approach to morality, right? So he thought, look, no, there's different types of virtues. If you're one of these sort of lower types of people, you'll have certain virtues. But if you're like the Uberman, right, the Overman or Superman, um, then there's different standards for you. And so Aristotle thinks in some ways, yeah, there are different standards for different people, right? The virtues of a carpenter are going to differ from the virtues of a teacher. Uh, for a carpenter, you might want them to be fairly muscular and have a certain amount of endurance. For a philosophy professor, that's so necessary, and so on, right? Um, and so, in ancient Greece, the virtues of an ancient Greek will differ from the virtues of an ancient Chinese person on the other side of the world, or from a modern American. But Aristotle does think there are some basic virtues appropriate to all humans. First of all, just because humans are social creatures, right? Um, Honesty is going to be necessary for any society to cohere, right? Um, all humans are going to need friends, and so loyalty will probably also be a virtue, and so on. So some of the basic needs that humans have for survival are going to entail that certain virtues are necessary. So a couple more sort of things, in favor of virtue ethics is that it makes motivation important for ethics. So we can contrast this with Kant's deontology. You may recall Kant thought morality can be derived entirely rationally, right? If I want to know what's the right thing to do, right, I run it through the categorical imperative. I decide whether there's a contradiction if I universalize my maxim. And if there isn't, it's moral, and if there is, then it's immoral, right? Um, and I tried to make Kant's approach healing in a way, right? I try to do that with all these theories. But if you think about it, it is sort of strange or sort of different than the way humans normally think about acting morally. So consider this example. Suppose that you're in the hospital, you just had a procedure and you're recovering. A friend comes to visit you. You're feeling kind of lonely and bored, and so it's nice. You have a nice time together. And as your friend is leaving, you say, "Hey, thank you so much for visiting me. That was really kind." Then your friend says, "Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I ran the categorical imperative. I realized that, yeah, I was morally obligated to come see you. So, I mean, I didn't particularly want to, and I honestly didn't have a time, but it was the moral thing to do." Well, if that was your friend's reaction, you would probably be a little disappointed, and you would probably sort of revise your assessment of your friend as like such a kind, moral person, right? You might think, oh, if he's only doing this because he sees that it's the rational thing to do, that feels a little empty, right? Um, we tend to want people to do the right thing because they want to do the right thing, right? It needs to come from their character and from their heart. Um, and virtue ethics gives you that, right? It's a it's a character trait, and from that character trait, right, flows these good actions, right? So you do it because you're the kind of person that does that, and you enjoy doing it, and you feel friendly, right, or you feel kind, and so virtue ethics gives you a motivational aspect to morality that for example, Kant and utilitarianism too. Really, utilitarianism is a fairly cold calculation as well, sort of an algorithm where you calculate pain and pleasure. Virtue ethics, moral motivation part of the story. And I mentioned this earlier, but a big plus for virtue ethics is that it allows room for partiality, right? It makes sense of why we think it's okay, and in fact, morally required to treat our children preferentially, right? I treat my child specially, better than other children, right? Well, yeah, that's the virtue of a parent, right? A virtuous parent will take a special interest in their child. Um, there are other virtues, more public virtues, and those are more impartial. But those are distinct, right? And when you're in your parenting role, yeah, you lavish attention and extra money and whatever on your child. And when you're in, but then when you're whatever president of the philosophy club, okay, that's then you have a different set of virtues, and there it's more impartial, right? And so on. And similarly, the way you treat your friends and things like that. So, you know, virtue ethics has an answer to why, and if there's a trolley problem and your mom's on one track and there's five strangers on the other, why you don't, you know, lever and kill your mom to save the five. It's because as a child, you have special duties. One of the virtues of being a child is having special duties to your parent and treating them better than other people. Okay, but now we're going to talk in these last couple slides about some problems with virtue ethics. None of these ethical theories are perfect. Okay. We're still studying ethics, right? Um, One thing we would like out of a moral theory is to tell us what to do, right? What action would be moral or not in given circumstances. And uh, it's not obvious, right? It's not nearly as obvious an answer that you get from virtue ethics as you get from utilitarianism or from Kant, right? Where they have sort of algorithms for you to follow to tell you what to do. Um, Here they're just sort of saying, well, do what a virtuous person would do. Um, and there's kind of two options, right? I mean, you could say, well, look, virtue ethics doesn't do that, right? Virtue ethics just tells us what good people are like, but it's not going to give us an answer for any given scenario, right? And that's going to be a little unsatisfying for a moral theory, right? It would be nice if our moral theory could tell us what. Or you could try to make virtue ethics give you an answer there, and the answer would have to be something like the right thing to do is what a virtuous person would do in that situation, right? And so, if you know any good people, right, you could sort of ask them or watch them or something like that. Um, and maybe, you know, again, if you were practicing these virtues and they become a habit, maybe you will just sort of automatically do the right thing when the situation arises. But you won't be able to really necessarily explain why or what made that thing right. Right? It's more of a skill that you develop. So that kind of leads to the last problem, which is the problem of incompleteness. So, Aristotle tells us, well, a good person is one that has the virtues, right? And there's good virtues and there's bad virtues. He doesn't really tell any, he tells us a little bit about, well, the good virtues, the ones that attract people, sorry, and the bad ones, the vices, are the ones that repel people. But that's sort of maybe a way to distinguish them, but it isn't sort of an account of what makes the virtues virtues, what makes the vices bad, right? Um, and there's ways you could fill it out, right? If you wanted to ask, well, what makes honesty good, right? What makes honesty a virtue, and what makes, um, you know, aggression or something a vice? Um, you could fill it in various ways. You might say, well, honesty tends to, produce more happiness for more people, right? Um, okay, well, guess what? You've just become ignorant, right? So if you flesh out virtue ethics in that way, where the ultimate goal is to virtue is that it creates pleasure, well, then you're really just a utilitarian. That's not really virtue ethics. Or, you might say, well, virtues are virtues because they help society run more smoothly. Honesty is good because it helps, humans are social creatures and it helps societies run. Well, that's kind of a social contract theory approach, then, right? So it's tricky to flesh out what makes virtues good and vices bad without collapsing into another moral theory, right? And if you don't have that further answer, then it's going to be hard to apply the theory in the tricky cases where you're not sure what to do. So, there's the open territory here again for analysis and ways to write papers. My personal take, I think, is if you're going to be a virtue ethicist, I think you have to say that, um, yeah, there's no algorithm, right, for doing the right thing, but it gives you a prescription for developing the skill, becoming a good basketball player. So, um, as a coach, I can't necessarily tell you exactly when is the precise moment and the precise angle to take a shot, right? But I can drill you, right, over and over until you just automatically make the right shot in the right circumstance, right? Um, and so maybe being a virtuous person and doing good things is more like getting right than it is like running an algorithm. Maybe that's my how I view it, but it's not the only way. Interesting theory, right? A lot of loose ends in it, which is, opportunities to say something original in a paper. So I will leave it here, relatively short today. We're going to dig into Aristotle.